it reconcile that contradiction? America created a story of race.
Race was never just a matter of how you look. It's about how people assign meaning to how you look.
We have the idea that it's somewhere written in stone that there are these fundamental differences between human beings. We don't realize that race is an idea that evolves over time, that it has a history, that it is constructed by a society to further certain political and economic goals.
Created over 4 centuries, race has become a powerful and enduring narrative. Moments in America's past reveal how this idea took hold and became the lens through which we view our world. Thomas Jefferson, a Virginia slaveholder, penned the revolutionary words proclaiming human equality in the Declaration of Independence. He also wrote a lesser-known, influential document, Notes on the State of Virginia. Written in response to questions from France about the American colonies, the book reads as a kind of sales pitch for America. Notes on the State of Virginia was not about race, but among Jefferson's descriptions of rivers and seaports, mountains and climate, he expressed his views on the inhabitants of the new land, people from America, Europe, and Africa.
I advance it as a suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind.
It is possible to make the argument that Thomas Jefferson is the first person to truly articulate a theory of race in the United States. And in effect, he has to do so. He has said in the Declaration of Independence that we are all created equal. Well, if in fact we're all created equal, and if in fact we're entitled to our liberty, then how can he possibly own 175 slaves and going up to about 225 slaves at the peak of his slaveholding?
In Notes, Jefferson's words appeared to justify slavery at a time when many were admonishing the Founding Fathers for espousing freedom, while continuing to support a system of human bondage.
The problem that they had to figure out is how can we promote liberty, freedom, democracy on the one hand, and a system of slavery and exploitation of peoples who are non-white on the other.
And the way you do that is to say, yeah, but there's something different about these people. This whole business of inalienable rights, that's fine, but it only applies to certain people.
The moment when we become a nation is critical for our understanding of both American nationality and race. We accept the notion that all men are created equal, but then perhaps some of those people who are enslaved are not quite men. That is, we'll keep our ideas of American nationality, but we'll write certain people out of the human family.
The suspicions of black racial inferiority raised by Jefferson had evolved over time, shaped in part by an intense need for labor in the American colonies. In 1619, when the first Africans arrived in Virginia, religion and wealth, not physical appearance, defined status. Blackness and whiteness were not yet clear categories of identity.
They were more likely to distinguish between Christians and heathens than they were between people of color and people who were white. They they regarded a person's status in life as somehow more fundamental than what color they were or what their particular background was.
The different ways in which those hierarchies of social class and social power became filled in with the content of race, so that the lowest class would be a black class and the highest class would be some particularly pale white class. That was a very gradual process.
For the first 50 years in the American colonies, most of the laborers were European indentured servants, many toiling on tobacco plantations in wretched conditions. With fewer Europeans braving the treacherous journey across the Atlantic, planters facing a potential labor shortage turned to the transatlantic slave trade and gradually replaced indentured servants with African slaves.
They found what they considered an endless labor supply. People who could be readily identified, and so when they ran away, they couldn't just meld into the population like Native Americans could. People who knew how to grow tobacco, people who knew how to grow rice. From their standpoint, the ideal labor source.
Colony by colony, new laws made slavery permanent and inheritable for Black people. And for the first time, the word white, rather than Christian or Englishman, began appearing in colonial statutes.
To what extent you could say this was actually conscious strategy, or what extent it was the result of a number of unthinking decisions that resulted in this, but it did buttress a kind of social structure.
As African slavery increased, lower-class Europeans won new rights and opportunities. Some even became overseers and bounty hunters responsible for policing the growing slave population.
The ordinary white people are not going to be complicit in this system unless they get something out of it. My belief is that payoff was in a certain status, prestige, recognition, ego enhancement that ordinary white people could derive from racism. And so there was a kind of bargain struck.
Many of the European-descended poor whites began to identify themselves, if not directly with the rich whites, certainly with being white. And here you get the emergence of this idea of a white race as a way to distinguish themselves from those dark-skinned people who they associate with perpetual slavery.
Slavery became identified with Africans. Blackness and slavery went together. That gave the white American the idea that Africans were a different kind of people.
There's a racial divide emerging that people began to see as natural, and that's part of where the idea of race comes from, is just in the tendency for people to see existing power relationships as having some sort of natural quality to them.
By the time Jefferson sat down to write Notes on the State of Virginia in 1781, a plantation economy dependent on slavery was deeply entrenched. Slavery had become so widespread that to many whites it seemed the natural state for Black people. But when Jefferson turned his attention to Indians in Notes, what appeared natural about them was their status as a free people, brave warriors protecting their lands. This led Jefferson to suspect that Indians were not much different from Europeans.
Their vivacity and activity of mind is equal to ours in the same situation. We shall probably find that they are formed in mind, as well as in body, on the same module with the Homo sapiens europaeus.
The original view of the Indians was that they were naturally white people and they looked slightly brown because of exposure to the sun and because of the way they treated their skin. Jefferson felt that, among many people at that time, felt that the Indians were good human material. And the problem with them was not race, but culture. That the Indians were savages, but they could be civilized.
Jefferson and his contemporaries were also influenced by European Enlightenment thinkers who believed that education and environment could improve people. But when Jefferson wrote about the Indians, he had little direct contact with them. Most Virginia tribes had been pushed west or killed off by war and European diseases.
Those in direct conflict with the Indians, those who were crossing the mountains to Kentucky or Tennessee, didn't think of the Indians in an Enlightenment view. They thought of Indians as savages who were trying to destroy peaceful settlers coming in and thought they should be driven out or exterminated.
There was an ever-encroaching white population who wanted our land. As a people, we were hunters, as anthropologists would describe us, as hunters and gatherers. We saw ourselves as equal people. We were free people. We had always been free people.
Many Indians fought to maintain their freedom and land. Within a decade of independence, wars with frontier tribes like the Shawnee, Miami, Kickapoo, and others threatened the stability of the young nation.
The United States decided that the cheapest, easiest way to avoid an Indian war along its entire frontier and also to acquire Indian land was to, quote, civilize the Indians. Civilization included Christian religion, it included an English education, and commercial agriculture. If you can convert Indians from hunters into farmers, if you could confine them to a small acreage, then you would have all this surplus land which could be open to white settlement.
Civilization policy was actually designed to assimilate us into America. It was ultimately to make us farmers, to live like the colonists lived. The civilization policy was to make us brown white men.
In notes on the state of Virginia, Jefferson implied Indians could be assimilated into American society. But he did not support assimilating Black people. He wrote of deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites and of physical and moral differences separating the groups.
Jefferson seems to have thought about it as a Virginia plantation owner who has been brought up among slaves and who, at his heart of heart, I would suppose, finds it difficult to conceive that those slaves are fully as equal.
It was through those eyes that the man who wrote the nation's credo, "All men are created equal," put forth as a suspicion only that the blacks are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind.
This difference is not simply a product of circumstance. It's not simply a product of the environment, but Jefferson broaches this possibility that it is something much deeper, something innate. We would say in our own language, Jefferson didn't have this language, we would say genetic.
But he says we will not be able to know this until science gives us the answers. And so he calls on science.
He sets American science on the path of trying to figure out what it is scientifically that makes blacks inferior to whites. And of course, if that's the question the scientist asks, then that's the question the scientist will answer.
And so from that moment on, you start to build a case that is specifically geared to tell the world that these people are different. Theories of race are used to do that.
In the next century, as the nation expanded, so would ideas about human difference. Science and slavery would help focus the nation's attention on the nature of Black people. But land would propel Native Americans into the racial spotlight.
A rising nation spread over a wide and fruitful land, traversing all the seas with the rich productions of their industry, advancing rapidly to destinies beyond the reach of mortal eye.
The hopes expressed by Jefferson in his first inaugural address were partially realized 2 years later in 1803, when the United States purchased the Louisiana Territory from France, doubling the size of the country.
Jefferson believed that the United States had a great future because it could expand through space, that the agrarian ideal of American independence could be maintained by expanding the country westward.
Obviously, there are very big problems with this. The land was not empty. One did overrun Indians.
At the time of the Louisiana Purchase, dozens of Indian tribes populated the vast new territory west of the Mississippi, and some Indian nations, like the Cherokee, still own massive tracts of land in the southeast.
Indians in the South lived in the region in which wealth was very firmly grounded in land. Planters needed land on which to grow tobacco, to grow cotton, to grow other staple crops. Indians occupied that land. Indians owned that land. And consequently, Indians were under constant pressure for that land.
In response to this pressure and defeats on the battlefield, some tribes like the Cherokee embraced the government's civilization policy first begun in the 1790s. They would put to the test Jefferson's words. "We shall all be Americans. Your blood will run in our veins and will spread with us over this great continent."
Most people consider the Cherokees to be the great success story of the civilization policy. The Cherokees were able very quickly to transform, at least on a superficial level, their culture. The Cherokees made many accomplishments that led their supporters to proclaim them to be civilized Indians.
One of the largest tribes in America, the Cherokees had lived in small villages in parts of what is now Kentucky, Virginia, Tennessee, the Carolinas, Alabama, and Georgia. By 1819, they had signed treaties ceding over 90% of their land to the United States. With the civilization policy, many Cherokees had switched from being hunters to farmers. Some even ran plantations and owned slaves. Their children learned Christian religion and English at mission-run schools. A Cherokee alphabet was created, and in the 1820s, the Cherokee Nation began publishing a bilingual newspaper. They established a government and constitution that was patterned after the United States.
The civilization policy was looked upon as a tool for survival. We began to see that that might be the only way for the Cherokee people to live in peace with the United States. Not so much that we wanted to become white people.
As the Cherokees became more and more prosperous along more or less classic white Southern lines, the nature of white government in America was changing. The federal government had to appeal to a much wider base of white American men than it had previously in the Revolutionary period. One of the main interests of this demographic of less well-off white American men was to get land so that they could become better off white American men. The main result of this, which was from the white point of view, an expansion of democracy and of democratic representation, of the inclusion of more and more people in American democracy. From the Indian point of view, was the gradual empowerment of exactly the population which would like to take what they had.
Every year, more white settlers arrived in Georgia seeking to settle on what was still Indian land. The federal government had promised to remove all Indians from the state in 1802. But 25 years later, with the Cherokees appearing even more entrenched, Georgia's legislature took action asserting the lands in question belong to Georgia. She must and she will have them. The state held a lottery giving whites title to Cherokee property.
Whites invaded their land, they killed people, they stole their property, they forced them out of their houses. Cherokees were really being pressed from all sides, it seemed.
The pressure on Cherokees and all Eastern Indians increased in 1828 when Andrew Jackson was elected president on a platform championing opportunity for the common man. Removing all Indians east of the Mississippi was central to his agenda.
When Jackson, who speaks out in a kind of a populist way, speaking for the little guy, speaking out against privilege, the little guy, his citizen is increasingly a white male citizen. As America is becoming more democratic for white males, it is becoming increasingly more race-based.
It's believed that only white people can maintain the land, preserve it, protect their own independence, and then using that independence have some sort of fitness for self-government that enables them to be proper citizens.
Nationalism begins to be, in many respects, equated to race. People began to think that nations should be composed of people who had inherent qualities in common. They thought the same way, they believed the same things, they spoke the same language, they looked the same. And this is very contradictory to the Enlightenment notions of a united humanity.
The conflict between Indian removal and America's founding ideals surfaced during bitter national debates. In a 3-day speech to his fellow congressmen, New Jersey Senator Frelinghuysen asked, "If we abandon these aboriginal proprietors of our soil, how shall we justify it to our country? How shall we justify this trespass to ourselves?" But Michigan Territory Governor Lewis Cass provided a justification, one that used race to focus on the nature of Indians, rather than the morality of their removal.
They have resisted every effort to ameliorate their situation. There must then be an inherent difficulty arising from the institutions, character, and condition of the Indians themselves.
The Indian Removal Act passed in 1830. When some tribes, including the Cherokees, resisted removal, President Jackson's response reflected the government's shift in racial thinking about the Indians.
They have neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, nor the desire of improvement, which are essential to any change in their condition. Established in the midst of another and superior race, they must necessarily yield to the force of circumstances and ere long disappear.
The Cherokees felt betrayed that we were considered savages. Jackson has remembered among Cherokees as someone to be vilified.
The identity of being Indian, or in this case of being Cherokee, which they had been told for decades to abandon as part of the past, as part of paganism, as a relic of primitive times, they were now told was inherent in them and that they should in some way embrace it. They should not become like white people. They should preserve themselves as Indians. And not only that, they should preserve themselves as Indians a very long way away.
The Cherokees vigorously fought removal against relentless pressure. But finally, in 1838, the United States Army forced them to leave their homes at gunpoint. 1/4 of the Cherokee Nation died in camps or on the journey west that became known as the Trail of Tears. By 1840, more than 70,000 southeastern Indians had been relocated west of the Mississippi.
The story of the Cherokee and their ultimate removal was also about who could be civilized and who couldn't. Who could be white, who could be a citizen of this country, and who could reside within its borders. And as the country moves west, that question gets answered in the same fashion over and over again.
8 years after the Trail of Tears, America went to war with Mexico to acquire more land. Supporters of the war argued that Mexicans were an inferior mongrel race. A popular guide for homesteaders described them as mere Indians, barbarous savages, who intend to hold this delightful region against the civilized world. When the war ended in 1848, the United States annexed 1/3 of Mexico's land.
Most white Americans really believed the West was for them and for them alone. But this was part of a whole philosophy of manifest destiny, of what impelled westward expansion throughout the middle part of the 19th century. This idea that the West belonged to white Americans.
As they continued their expansion westward, some white Americans would use science to justify their actions and support their belief in racial superiority.
During the 19th century, there were lots of public lectures on the races of man. Science was, because it was new, was something people were avidly interested in. Science in the 19th century was expected to reveal all the mysteries of the universe.
You even see specific references by this period where they're saying race is the great issue of the age.
The nation's interest in race was more than idle fascination. In the 1840s, the question of whether slavery would expand to newly acquired Western lands was bitterly dividing the nation and fueling attacks on slavery.
There was significant momentum towards the abolition of racial slavery, but there were also very strong countervailing trends. And in the end, this created an enormous tension within white society because it was caught in this contradiction that was inescapable.
As people begin to oppose slavery, the whole question of what the difference between the races is and what the status of Black people should be becomes more debated. In the context of this debate over slavery versus anti-slavery, ideas about race really flesh out.
In 1846, 5,000 people gathered in Boston to hear The Plan of Creation in the Animal Kingdom, the first American lecture by renowned Swiss naturalist Louis Agassiz. His methods valued observation over speculation. Agassiz was quickly pulled into the scientific question of the day. Are all people, no matter their physical features, members of the same or different species?
It's a debate between people who look at the book of Genesis and see what they call a single creation. God created Adam and Eve. And scientists who say, well, actually, these races couldn't possibly have come from the same place. There must be different and separate creations.
Agassiz arrived in America, supporting the theory that all humans were united in a single creation. But he soon began to rethink his position after meeting one of America's most distinguished scientists, Samuel Morton. A Philadelphia physician, Morton owned the world's largest collection of human skulls and had written 2 influential books documenting what he claimed were innate differences among humans. One focused on American Indians.
The foundation work was a work called Crania Americana, in which he argued that he was using purely scientific methods to investigate the question of skull size, skull capacity, which had implications for brain size, which he thought was vital in how races progressed.
Lo and behold, he discovers that white American males are the smartest people on earth, followed in gradation by the English, the French, and then other Europeans, and then other races with blacks always on the bottom. Curiously, some English scholars do the same thing. They discover Englishmen are actually smarter than Americans, followed by French and other Europeans. And guess what? The French discover that the French are really smarter than both.
Somehow he managed to make sort of systematic errors in favor of what was the sort of understood hierarchy of the races of the day. Samuel Morton drew wild conclusions based on very careful studying and ranking of these skulls. I don't care how many times you measure a skull or even anything physical about an individual or a group of people, you cannot predict their morality, their behavior, their achievements, potential for achievement. But that was what was important about this idea of race at the time.
Southerners were actually delighted at what the scientists were doing. They were hearing from, if you like, non-special interests that there were huge differences between the races. Now, this meant that the South began to argue quite vigorously that the best scientific opinion is saying that slaves cannot exist within a free white society and that they are inferior.
The ultimate defense of slavery is a racial defense. That blacks are inferior and therefore they are ready-made slaves. God created them as slaves.
Why all this rant about Negro equality, asked John Campbell in his book Negromania, seeing that neither nature or nature's God ever established any such equality? Josiah Nott, a Southern doctor and disciple of Morton, firmly believed that black people were a separate species and used science to wage a vigorous defense of slavery.
Though he was a good doctor, for the period, and well regarded as an expert on yellow fever, he immediately starts to show from his very first writings that when he writes about race, he throws off really any scientific realism at all and writes from his prejudices. It seems so exaggerated. It looks like the publication you'd get on a sort of a dirty little leaflet that some fringe organization has published, and yet it's accepted scientific fact for a time.
As these ideas took hold, pro-slavery advocates argued that the enslavement of black people did not violate the democratic spirit of America, because Jefferson's term, all men, did not scientifically include black people. In 1850, Louis Agassiz, by then Harvard's most prominent professor, told his fellow members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science that, viewed zoologically, the several races of men were well marked and distinct. Josiah Nott wrote to Samuel Morton, "With Agassiz in the war, the battle is ours."
Here was the most objective, the pinnacle of the scientific man influenced by American racism, and who transformed his deeply held belief in the unity of mankind. I think that says more than anything else that the power of the ideology of race can change people's minds.
3 years later, Agassiz contributed a chapter to a forthcoming book, co-authored by Nott. The 738-page Types of Mankind was greatly anticipated. It pre-sold its entire first edition.
Types of Mankind was tremendously influential. It was the first time that scientists pulled together all of the research that justified the argument that African Americans, Native Americans, Asians, etc., were different species.
Nations and races, like individuals, have each an especial destiny. Some are born to rule, and others to be ruled. And such has ever been the history of mankind. No two distinctly marked races can dwell together on equal terms.
Types of Mankind was one of the best-selling science books of its day. Among the first to buy it were the United States Departments of State, Navy, and Treasury.
Science and the politicians and popular opinion weld together in a way that is extremely useful for both. The politicians and the general population are very happy to have scientific views to lean on, which say that the fact that this successful republic is not destroying Indians just for the love of it. They're not enslaving blacks because they're selfish. They're not overrunning Mexican lands because they're avaricious for land. That this is part of some great inevitability of science, of really the way races are constituted. That is, the Caucasian race and even certain branches within the Caucasian race are superior.
It's a way of sort of naturalizing a social structure which everyone understood and clearly saw that the quote unquote the Negro, or in other regions of the country, the Native American or the Chinese, were at the bottom of the social and political hierarchy. And if you can say that they are fundamentally biologically different, then they should be.
In the 1857 Dred Scott case, the Supreme Court decided that people of African ancestry, enslaved or free, could never become citizens of the United States. The opinion stated that Black people had no rights which the white man was bound to respect.
There's been a remarkable transformation, because if you're thinking, say, 50 or 60 years before in American history, you've got Jefferson ambiguously talking about, well, he thinks possibly blacks are not quite of the same capacity as whites, but he isn't sure. But they get to the 1850s, people are writing, there are deep, irrevocable gulfs between the races.
The conflict over slavery led the nation to war. After President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, his administration consulted Louis Agassiz on how to deal with the newly freed Black population. Agassiz advised, "Beware of how we give to the Blacks rights by virtue of which they may endanger the progress of whites. they are incapable of living on a footing of social equality.
If America had just looked the world in the eye and said, we hold these people in slavery because we need their labor and we've got the power to do it. Now that would have been much better, because then when the power was gone, when slavery is over, it's over. But what we said was, there's something about these people. By doing that, it means that when slavery is over, that rationalization for slavery remains.
In the late 19th century, as the United States expanded beyond its continental borders, ideas of racial difference would become widely accepted at home and help define a new role for America abroad.
Let me stop there. There's a piece I want to do before I send you away. Thoughts, comments on what you saw? This stuff is heavy, huh? Pretty thick. At least I think so. So the rest of the documentary is online, and I'll let you watch that at your convenience. It's refers to the white man's burden, and we'll talk more about that on Monday. So as a part of my work, so I was a classroom teacher. I also was the affirmative action officer for Anoka County. You guys know where Anoka is, right? So for Anoka County, and part of my job was to count the number of employees that we had and make reports to the federal government based on what folks we had in our stuff. So there was specific guidelines by which I was supposed to do that, provided by the federal government of the United States of America. And so I just snagged a piece of the document that I used in the work that I did, provided by the federal government of the United States, as it pertains to racial or ethnic definitions of groups. People I was supposed to identify in the workplace. And so this is the language that comes directly from the federal government of the United States as it pertains to race and ethnicity. And in this particular case, they do not make a differentiation between the two. And so in many ways, the two get convoluted, although we will talk about them in separate ways. But the federal government of the United States of America describes folks in these ways. So the prologue, the precursor, the preface, if you will, to these descriptions is this: race and ethnic identification. Self-identification is the preferred method of identifying the race or ethnicity information necessary for the EEO-1 report. So people self-identifying is the preferred method, which also means if it's the preferred method, what does that suggest? There's also another method, right? So the preferred method is to have people do. But in the case that they don't, there's another method, right? Hence, the other method is following that period, right? So employers are required to attempt to allow employees to use their self-identification to complete the EEO-1 report. If an employee declines to self-identify, the employment record or observer's identifications may be used. In that sentence, what is the biggest problem in that sentence? That last sentence that I just read. this sentence right here. If an employer declines to self-identify, what's the problem? Okay, so it could be that they decline. The observer's identification. The observer's identification. So, my wife is Assiniboine. They're a nation of Native Americans that dips down into the United States from Canada. So most of their folks are in Canada. They dip down into Montana, into the United States from Canada. We go to. She hates going to Mexican restaurants, and I use that word very specifically because that's what they say on the thing. Mexican restaurant. She hates going into Mexican restaurants. And she hates going to Mexican restaurants because the people keep asking her why she doesn't speak Spanish. And why does my wife not speak Spanish? She's not Spanish. She's not Hispanic. She's not Latino. She's not Latina. But from the observer's point of view, they think she's so her mother did some mission work in China. And there were a lot of Chinese people who were upset at her because they wondered why she did not speak Chinese. And why were they upset at her for not speaking Chinese? Because from the observer's point of view, they thought she should have been Chinese, so she should have spoke. Right? Now, so the observer's identification may be used. Now, what is the problem with an observer? Or what are the challenges with being an observer? What viewpoint do observers use to view? Their own point of view. So you can only observe from your position. I can't see, and we try to say this a lot, I want you to see this from my position. I can't, because I come out of a particular context that says this is how I see the world. So I can't see it any different. All right, so that being said, now this is what I think is really interesting. Now this is the federal government of the United States. The United States government, the place you pay taxes. Race and ethnic designation as used by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission do not denote scientific definitions of anthropological origins. So the designations used by this federal entity do not denote scientific definitions. So if science isn't defining this, what is? Do they say? No. But they give a definition. They start definitions of race and ethnicity categories are as follows. So we're not using science to define this. So what is the suggestion? How are they defining these things that are going to follow?
By looks.
What's that?
By looks.
By looks? They're making it up. So if it's not empirical data, if it's not talking about directly relating that to anthropological origins, if it's not talking about what they're saying by not saying this is they're saying we're about to make some stuff up. And this is what they made up. Hispanic or Latino, a person of Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, South Central American, or other Spanish culture of origin, regardless of race. Hispanic or Latino. We'll come back to that because we'll see that as a recurring theme, and we'll ask ourselves the question why in just a second. Next category, white, not Hispanic or Latino. We'll ask ourselves why in just a second. Is a person having any origins of any of the original peoples of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa? What? Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa? So people from Iran, they are white. People from Libya, Afghanistan, Egypt, Morocco. Next category, Black or African American, who is not Hispanic or Latino. A person having any origins of any of the Black racial groups of Africa. But not, interesting. Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander who is not Hispanic or Latino. A person having any origins of the peoples of Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, or other Pacific Islands. Have you seen people who are from Hawaii, Guam, or other Pacific Islands? Yes? Dwayne Johnson. What's his race or ethnicity? He's Samoan, and he's also Black. Isn't that crazy? Have you seen him lately? Dude's huge, ginormous, right? So he's on somebody's roids, right? But he got this big old tattoo on his arm. Isn't that a cool tattoo that he has? A big old tattoo on his arm. And I saw somebody on Facebook who had a tattoo just like his. Arm wasn't as big as his, but he had Dwayne's tattoo. And what was the problem with the dude having Dwayne's tattoo? He doesn't know why Dwayne has the tattoo. Context is everything, and we'll come back to that. So, Asian, a person having any of the original peoples of the Far East, Southeast Asia, or Indian subcontinent, including, for example, Cambodia, China, India, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, Pakistan, the Philippine Islands, Thailand, and Vietnam. Have you ever met any people from any of these regions? Do they even look alike in any of these regions? So how are they all Asian? American Indian or Alaskan Native, a person having origins of any of the original peoples of North and South America, including Central America, who maintain tribal affiliation or community attachment. So the qualifications for being an American Indian or Alaskan Native is maintaining tribal affiliation or community attachment. But what happens if your grandparents were sent to a boarding school where they were detached from their community and don't have tribal affiliations? What are you? Don't know. Lastly, more of two races who are not Hispanic or Latino. All persons who have identified with more of the above races. As an observer, I can pick this as a category. I can pick this as a category as an observer of which of these others this person is two of. So let's go back to the Hispanic or Latino. Why does that keep coming up? Not Hispanic or Latino. What do we know about Hispanic and Latino, Cubans, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, South and Central Americans? What do we know about those folks? What's the context by which they were found? They're a mix of all sorts of folks. Cubans look all sorts of different ways, light skin, dark skin, all in the same family, because this Hispanic or Latino group has been mixed with indigenous people, with African people, with Spanish, with European Spanish folks. So they look all sorts of different kinds of ways. So we can't tell this crazy racial group what people are. So we lump them into this one language category. Right? Does any of that make sense to you? Doesn't make sense to me. Doesn't make sense to the federal government, but we choose to use this in the United States. And guess what Canada has? Something totally different. What do you think Mexico has? Something totally different. Sweden, totally different. So if we're looking at this idea of race consciousness as a thing, we have to call it for what it is, which is a way to organize people in a way that the governments know how to deal with folks. It's a tool used by our governments to organize us. And so to what end? I find it interesting, and I want you to think about this as I let you guys go. I want you to think about this. Are there neighborhoods? So first of all, let's go back to the beginning, right? How many days did it take the Creator to create everything that is? 6 days. Rested on the seventh, which means everything that was created on the 8th day was created by whom? By us. Now, what do we know about the things that we create? They fall apart, they're limited in their ability to exist, and we can recycle them, right? So we can recycle those things. So this idea of race and ethnicity, I would call an 8th day creation. So neighborhoods. Are there certain neighborhoods where certain racial or ethnic groups show up where you come from? Are there certain neighborhoods where certain people live based on racial or ethnic groupings? Yeah? Yeah. How did that happen? I want you to go back to the creation. It took the Creator how long? 6 days. Rested on the 7th. How did the neighborhoods that have these different ethnic groups come to existence? We created them as human beings. And we'll talk more about that on Monday. All right? So I want to hit you. I wanted to give this to you as a tool. This is absolutely mind-blowing to me that even professionals who are in the field, people who fill out their HR forms, don't even know that this is the kind of stuff that's happening, how they're being identified. The scariest thing, the most worrisome thing that I had to do with my 18-month-old daughter, it was the most puzzling and agonizing decision that we had to make with my daughter was what was going to be her racial designation at the hospital. And so they said, well, what's her racial designation going to be? I said, Cuban. That's what I said. In the future, that's going to be the most advantageous for her. We teach her Spanish. She's going to look Cuban, right? You get big curly hair, big shiny face, and just gorgeous, right? But now I was rethinking that, and I'm thinking maybe I should have said Indian, because speaking Hindi is going to be very important once people leave the subcontinent of India, because there are more people speaking their language there than in most places of the world. So once in the future, I think, it's Spanish that's really popular now. I think in the future will be those Indian dialects, but that's just me in my tin hat kind of thing. So, no, but I wanted to give you this as a tool. The rest of the documentary it's got about 15 minutes left. It's in your Moodle. Look for it there. Also look for your quiz. Submit that quiz before Monday. And you guys know how Moodle works, so it times everything. So I know when folks submitted it and whatnot. ZTAG folks, if you give me 5, I'd appreciate it. And I will see you guys on Monday. Get this out my face.
Oh, are we supposed to sit?
Oh, you can have a seat. No, you can just have a seat. So I put some resources in the Moodle. Have folks been able to see those yet? Those resources for CTAC? Okay. Last evening.
Because I looked yesterday afternoon.
Okay. Okay, so I put them in there. I'm also going to make a call. I have I spoke yesterday about my friend over at Fridley, and he contacted me yesterday. He said, "Let me know what kind of hours you're looking at, and he'll see what he can do." So we'll get that going. What was the other thing? That's that. Have people thought about where they want to go, how they want to operate with that? Okay. A couple of people have told me of places that they've done some things before. We've made a little bit of augmentation to those things, so those things can work with a bit of a twist. If you're having some problems thinking about some places or making contacts with the places that I've given you, make sure you just communicate with me so that we can get this stuff for you, get it done for you. All right. Had I known how the ZTAG thing was going to work for this class, I'd have set this stuff up for you long before you could have walked into some stuff. But we'll figure it out together. All right. If you have any questions, just hit me up on Facebook. Just hit me on Moodle and I'll respond. And my Bethel email address is working. So I look to hear from you if you have any questions or concerns. Have a great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Have a good weekend.
You too.